Okay, we're at Module 5, Learning Objective 4, taking a look at the difference between the GDP deflator and the Consumer Price Index. There's a lot of test questions that will apply to this particular concept, and understanding how the GDP deflator and the Consumer Price Index differ is kind of important. One is that the GDP deflator, what it does is it holds the quantities constant and allows prices to change, whereas the Consumer Price Index holds quantities constant and allows prices to change. So we kind of take a look at the difference between the two in this model. Okay, so looking at our two measures of inflation, we do see that nominal and real GDP are two measures of inflation, nominal, and looking at our percent per year here, we have the GDP deflator and the Consumer Price Index. They are very closely related. How we calculate them is a bit different. And again, what data that we have will dictate which one we can calculate. So one thing that's important is that in the Consumer Price Index, we include imports. So this is an important one. So we're going to include imports in the Consumer Price Index. But remember, because the GDP deflator is based on GDP, then it's excluded from the GDP deflator. If you kind of think about what is in GDP or refer back to the formula for GDP, these things kind of make sense, why the two deflators are, why the CPI and GDP deflator is different. In terms of capital goods, remember, we don't include those in the Consumer Price Index because these are the ones that are purchased by consumers. But again, if we think about the GDP deflator, we would include capital goods as part of the investment category in the GDP deflator. Again, how it's calculated, remember that the Consumer Price Index fixes the quantity and allows the price to change, whereas the GDP deflator fixes the quantity and allows prices to change. So those are kind of two different ways of looking at this. Okay, in each scenario, determine the effects on the CPI and GDP deflator. Okay, so let's go ahead and let me minimize this, and we can go ahead and take a look at what some of the answers to these questions are. Okay, so in each scenario, determine the effects on the CPI and GDP deflator. So the first one, Starbucks increases the price of Frappuccinos. Well, in the Consumer Price Index, would Frappuccinos be considered in the Consumer Price Index? Yes, because consumers spend money on that. So the CPI would increase. And looking at the GDP deflator, well, we know that the GDP deflator consumption, when people purchase Frappuccinos, would increase. Therefore, the GDP deflator would be increased as well. All right, let's look at the next one. Caterpillar raises the price of the industrial tractors it manufactures at its Illinois factory. Well, because these are tractors and so they are a capital good, CPI would remain unchanged or flat. Whereas the GDP, because this is part of the investment category of GDP, GDP is actually going to increase. Armani raises the price of the Italian jeans it sells to the U.S. Well, in selling the jeans, would that be part of CPI? Sure would be clothing, so the CPI would increase. But because they're being produced in Italy, they would be then an import, and because they're an import, we know that that would decrease net exports, which then would decrease the GDP. So again, you can see some variations depending on which you're looking at and how each product enters into the nation or into the mix of either the GDP or the CPI. We could even say here that the GDP remains flat because it would not be, we don't really know what the impact would be overall in the GDP deflator. So I'm just going to say that it kind of remains flat here. And again, GDP looking at increase and decrease as well. Okay, and just checking our answers, we see that the CPI and GDP deflator both rise because, again, it's a purchase. Caterpillar raises the price of the industrial tractors. Again, it's included in the investment category, so GDP deflator rises. The consumer price index does not. And then the last one, the consumer price index rises, but the GDP deflator does not.